Hey guys, welcome to another episode of U.S. History with Lennox, and today we're looking at the rise of progressivism in our national government. Now, in 1898, William McKinley was elected president, and this marked the end of the political stalemate that had existed throughout the Gilded Age. It also marks the beginning of our fourth political party system. McKinley is going to spend the first half of his presidency leading America through the Spanish-American War. But unfortunately, he's going to meet his demise at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. He's going to be assassinated by an anarchist by the name of Leon Czolgosz. And Czolgosz is going to shoot McKinley in a receiving line. When he went up to shake his hand, he was holding a gun in his hand and shot McKinley at point-blank range. 8 days later, the president will pass away from gangrene. This is going to elevate Teddy Roosevelt to the presidency. And what Teddy Roosevelt is going to do is take the progressive ideas that have been building at the local and state levels and bring them to the national government. So here we go. Welcome to the 20th century and welcome to the progressive era. Following the assassination of McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt will step into the presidency. Now, Roosevelt believed that the president should control the legislative actions of the country. And because of that belief, we're going to see an acceleration towards this idea of national progressivism. When you look at the goals of the progressives during this time, they're all rooted in the idea of a stronger central government. They wanted their government to be based on scientific principles, which kind of falls back to the Wisconsin idea of getting experts into different jobs. They wanted to see the moral improvement of society. They wanted businesses to be regulated. They wanted control taken back from the monopolies and trusts of the Gilded Age. And they wanted to increase political democracy in our country. And Roosevelt supported all of that. We're also going to see during this time amendments come to the forefront and be added to the U.S. Constitution. Just a quick review of those amendments. The 16th Amendment is going to allow for a federal income tax. Remember, that was an idea that the populists had. Another idea they had was the direct election of senators. That will be the 17th Amendment. The 18th Amendment is going to institute prohibition of alcohol in our country. And finally, the 19th Amendment will be passed, giving women the right to vote. So let's look at this Republican Roosevelt. Let's look at who he was. Number one, he was an activist, and he knew how to guide or control public opinion. He believed that his presidency should be what they called the bully pulpit, and he was going to use that to advocate what he wanted to see done in our country. And unlike the presidents we saw during the Gilded Age, the forgotten presidents, TR believed that social inequality needed to be addressed. He believed that his job was to be a steward of the people and to affirmatively do all he could for the constituents that put him into office. And going back to that progressive ideal that we should use scientific reasoning within the government, meaning we should have experts running our government agencies, Roosevelt's going to implement that. He's going to bring Elihu Root, who had been the previous district attorney of New York City, and make him Secretary of State. William Taft will become the Secretary of War. William Taft had been the governor of the Philippines after the Philippine insurrection during the Spanish-American War. And finally, Gifford Pinchot, who will be appointed as a chief conservationist. Teddy Roosevelt believed in conserving nature, and so he is going to make that one of the mainstays of his administration. One of the first challenges Roosevelt's going to have to face is a major labor strike, the anthracite coal strike in 1902. The United Mine Workers struck for higher pay and an 8-hour workday. Sounds familiar, right? It's going to last 11 months, and it's really going to start threatening the nation because, to quote Game of Thrones, winter is coming and America's going to be cold. That's when Roosevelt got involved. He is going to jump into the arbitration and not side with owners, which is a complete shift from what we've seen from other presidents of the Gilded Age, who always sided with big business. No, instead, what TR did was he forced both sides to come together and negotiate a deal. And he threatened that if they couldn't do that, the government was going to go in and take over the mine and no one would get what they wanted. And they came up with a compromise, surprisingly, that they could both live with. It was referred to as the square deal. And this term square deal is going to become synonymous with Teddy Roosevelt's domestic policy. It's also going to be the inspiration for other presidents in the future. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal, Woodrow Wilson and his New Freedom, and Harry Truman with his Fair Deal. So what was the compromise that they reached in the coal strike? Well, labor had asked for a 20% increase in wages and a reduction to a 9-hour workday. In the end, what they're going to agree to is a 10% raise and a 9-hour workday, along with the fact that the union would not be recognized, meaning they're not going to give more power to the union. And all it took was a threat from the president to nationalize the coal mines and take the power away from both sides. Go figure. This term, like I said, square deal, is going to become synonymous with Teddy Roosevelt's domestic policy. And the goals of his policy were simple. He wanted to get control of the corporations, he wanted to protect the consumer, and he wanted to conserve natural resources. We refer to that as the 3 C's, the 3 C's of the square deal: corporations, consumer protection, and conservation. Let's first talk about the corporations. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be known as the trust buster. He saw the negative side of these huge monopolies, but he also saw a positive side. He believed that good trust, good monopolies were necessary for the public good, but the bad trusts were only focused on greed, wealth, and power, and those were the ones that we needed to get rid of. So to control both sides, what he's going to do is push for the creation of the Department of Commerce and Labor, and their sole purpose is going to be investigating these businesses to make sure there's no misconduct. In 1902, he is actually going to target one of these large trusts, the Northern Securities Company. And the Northern Securities Company was this huge railroad holding company that was controlled by J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and J.J. Hill. And he is going to allege that they were in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And believe it or not, for the very first time in our history, a trust is going to be broken up. The Northern Securities Company is deemed in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and they're going to have to break up their holdings. Roosevelt had taken on the giants of the monopolies. Now, while he had taken down the Northern Securities Company, he did recognize that monopolies were a fact of life. But instead of breaking them all up, he thought the best way to control them was to regulate them. And in a sense, we could tame them, much like we see some of the bears in this cartoon being tamed. But he wasn't consistent in his trust busting. He went against different trusts such as the Beef Trust, American Tobacco, Standard Oil, and others. But he also looked to those same companies, those same monopolies, to help him get reelected in 1904. So while on one hand he was going after the monopolies, on the other hand, he's seeking their help. For instance, when he was trying to get reelected in 1904, he looked to J.P. Morgan for advice. And he is actually going to allow some monopolies to form under this guise of, I need to get back in office. But in the end, he is going to bust 44 trusts during his 7-year presidency. Of course, Taft, his successor, is going to break up 90, but TR is the trust buster. He's also going to look at regulation of the railroads. 2 major acts are going to be passed during his presidency, the Elkins Act in 1903 and the Hepburn Act in 1906. Basically, the Elkins Act regulates the rate of railroads. So what they did was set a rate that the federal government would oversee. And then the Hepburn Act is actually going to expand the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission, giving them more jurisdiction over more businesses, specifically the railroads. He's going to run for re-election in 1904, and he's going to get re-elected fairly easily. What's interesting about this election is that you do have a socialist candidate in Eugene V. Debs running as well. During the campaign, Roosevelt is promising to run on just one more term. He literally said, under no circumstances will I be a candidate or accept another nomination. During his second term, he's going to focus on the second C of the square deal, consumer protection. Remember talking about Upton Sinclair and that book, The Jungle, where he attacked the meatpacking industry and talked about all the nasty stuff that was going on in those factories? Well, because of that, we're going to see the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, which made it illegal to falsely label food and drugs, as well as establish the Food and Drug Administration that would oversee all of those industries that were dealing with our food or with our medicines. He's also going to pass the Meat Inspection Act, and for this one, I'm quite grateful, which prohibited, again, misleading labels and any harmful chemicals from getting into your meat. Believe it or not, during the Gilded Age, one way they cleaned the meat was just by dumping bleach in there. Well, thanks to the Meat Protection Act, we don't have to worry about bleach in our meat today. Finally, conserving the land. Roosevelt wanted to create a national conservation policy that would protect all the lands that he had visited and seen, especially in the West. And how he defined conservation was using our natural resources wisely. So he is going to sign an executive order that will set aside 150 million acres of forest just for conservation. He's also going to sign the Newlands Reclamation Act, which will promote irrigation projects in the West, specifically in the Great Plains, and put another 230 million acres under federal protection. The Antiquities Act of 1906 set aside land for national monuments, for scientific and cultural features that America could enjoy for generations. And he also set up the plan to create the National Park Service. It'll come into existence in 1916. This map shows you where the national parks and forests can be found throughout our country, and this was all started by Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt kept his promise and did not run for another term, but he did tap his own candidate, and that's going to be William Howard Taft, who had served with him throughout his 7 years as president. The idea was that Taft would maintain TR's agenda. When you look at who was running, Taft, again, was facing some old foes in William Jennings Bryan for the Democrats
and Eugene Debs on the socialist ticket.
But he is going to win quite easily with TR's backing. You can tell on this map that he took pretty much all of the northern and western states. What's interesting about Taft is he said, "I felt like a fish out of water." He goes, "I hate the limelight." He's president of the United States, but he wasn't ready to pick up Roosevelt's agenda and run with it. He didn't have the same viewpoint. He didn't trust the government to actually regulate business. And as he said, he didn't like the limelight, so he didn't have that flair that TR had. He didn't use the presidency as a bully pulpit. In fact, a lot of people said he was too honest and too sincere to be the president. He did tend to side with the more conservative. He did tend to side with the more conservative Republicans, and we did have a little bit of a split in the Republican Party. You had the conservative ones and the more progressive ones, like TR was. So what will happen? He's going to start targeting trusts that TR had said were good trusts, like U.S. Steel. He's going to pass the Payne-Aldrich tariff, a protective tariff that the conservative Republicans believed in, but the progressive Republicans saw as an affront to their desire to control big business. And finally, the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. Taft is going to appoint Richard Ballinger to oversee some of the lands that have been set aside to open them up for private interest. And when Pinchot, who had been appointed by TR, criticizes Ballinger and his actions, Taft is going to fire him. Well, that's going to tick TR off. Now, despite some of the challenges that Taft faces, he is going to be successful in passing through this progressive legislation that was so important to TR and other progressives, specifically the 16th and 17th Amendment. Now, the 16th Amendment, again, created a national income tax, and the 17th Amendment finally set it up where we directly elected our senators. Now, even though it was pushed through during Taft's presidency, it's not going to be ratified under Taft's presidency. It's actually going to happen during Wilson's presidency, but it was Taft who got it done. The passage of these two amendments is vindication for the populace, because this is two of the big ideas that they were pushing for in their platform in the election of 1892. He is also going to institute safety codes for workers, specifically in the mines and on the railroads, and he will create a children's bureau that's going to work towards ending child labor in America. Even though he did all that, TR is ticked. He is not happy that Taft did not follow his policies the way he wanted to. So he decides to run again for the Republican nomination. But the conservative Republicans within the party refuse to allow him to come back. They're like, no, you had your time. We're moving on with Taft. So what did TR do? Created his own party. It was called the New Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, because TR said he's feeling like a bull moose and he's just going to run in and take over. This is going to divide the Republican Party even further. We already had the division between conservatives and progressives, but now we're starting to see a split. Democrats are going to nominate Woodrow Wilson. Now, he had served as the president of Princeton University as well as the New Jersey governor, and he was known to be a progressive reformer. In the election of 1912, you had two big ideas, TR's New Nationalism and Wilson's New Freedom. Both of these ideas focused on the economy, but Wilson did not have much trust for the power of the government or a national plan, whereas TR's New Nationalism was all about a national plan. Wilson believed in a small government, free trade, and competition amongst businesses, whereas TR was more focused on social justice reforms like the protection of women and children and workers and maintaining the idea of good trust. Interestingly, TR will be the first candidate to enlist the help of women in his election. When it comes time for the vote, TR and Taft just split it, leaving the door wide open for Democrat Woodrow Wilson to become the next president of the United States. But not only that, they won the House and they won the Senate as well. Because remember, Republicans are split. So not only did it split the presidential vote, it split the congressional vote as well. I call this history math. When you take the GOP and divide it by a bull moose, you're always going to end up with a Democrat. This election, honestly, is probably the most significant election in history since the election of Abraham Lincoln. If you remember correctly, it was the Democrats who were split in that one between Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. So that's it. That's a look at national progressivism under the presidencies primarily of Teddy Roosevelt and William Taft. Wilson is going to try to continue some of these ideas with his New Freedom Plan, but what he's going to run into in the midst of his presidency is a world war. So that's going to make reform at home a little bit more difficult. Thanks for watching. Again, if you missed anything, go ahead and rewind. Otherwise, we'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.